And at the time I was finishing the book I wrote on animal and human experimentation, and kind of had this idea of writing some big, huge book about public anatomy in Europe. And since I was in Paris, after I finished the book, I started going to the archives, actually, around January. And just kind of, people started sort of coming up who looked interesting, and particularly this guy, Duverney, who nobody had written anything about. And I thought, hey, nobody's written anything about this guy. Great topic. So then I kind of was moving at that point then toward writing a book just about Duverney, and then realized he's kind of the center of this kind of nexus of people, which included particularly Claude Perrault, another person nobody had written much of anything about. Claude Perrault was the brother of the much better known Joseph Perrault, who was, the fairy tale guy, who was one of Colbert's right-hand men in Louis XIV's court. And so Claude, however, was pretty important in the Paris Academy of Sciences, but he was, there's still not a lot known about his kind of personal life or anything like that. I don't even know if he got married. I don't think he ever did. So that's kind of how it started framing itself, and it took me forever to write this because I kept kind of going down different paths, writing about different things. I spent a couple of years writing about monsters and writing about anatomists in London and in Edinburgh and this other stuff, and I kind of came back to this. So, this is the book. The title I owe to one of my former grad students, Nicole Archambault, because we were talking about kind of courtiers and anatomists, and I said, well, the courtier's anatomist, except it's not one courtier or one anatomist. She said, well, what about the courtier's anatomist? And I thought, that's a really good idea. So then, and I proposed this to Chicago, and unlike my first book, whose title got totally mangled and put through the shredder, they actually liked this title. so that's where we are. And it is about animals and humans. So it's about experimenting on animals, which, as most of you know, I've been writing about since forever. But it's also about human dissection. So it's about both of those things, and it's particularly about the Paris. So I'm going to start by reading you a little bit from the introduction, and then we'll read kind of the beginning of the book. So, and excuse my French pronunciation, which I know is terrible. So, Bob, forgive me. So, this book is about bodies, human and animal, dead and living. Particular bodies in a particular place and time. The place and time is the city of Paris during the reign of Louis XIV, between 1643 and 1715. In this context, the Courtiers Anatomists explores the role of dissection in the development of experimental methods in 17th century science, and the central role of animals in those methods in that science, as well as in the wider cultural field of the second half of the 17th century and into the 18th. This is a book about 17th century science, but it's not a book about the scientific revolution. The medieval historian Caroline Walker Bynum recently commented that ideas, events, and practices always change in a complex mutual relationship. My goal in this book is to add another level of complexity to the ongoing historical discussion of ideas, events, and practices, in that era commonly known as the scientific revolution. I don't use that phrase in this book, not so much because I believe with Stephen Chapin that there was no such thing as a scientific revolution, as because the phrase has been taken by many historians and non-historians to mean a particular set of ideas, events, and practices focused on mathematics, physics, and astronomy, with more recently the addition of alchemy and chemistry. This book is not about those things. Why Paris? In the 17th century, Paris was the most populous city in Europe, and Louis XIV was the most powerful monarch. As a center of cultural production, Paris contributed to the birth of many of the cultural markers of modernity, including the novel, modern contrapuntal music, and the arts of printing, engraving, and illustrating, and painting, as well as science. Yet compared to London, 17th century Paris has been much less explored as a site of science or of these interrelated activities. This was a period of vast changes in Paris and in science. And while Parisians certainly participated in the wider world of early modern science, they also developed ideas and practices unique to their particular place and moment. Scientific Paris under Louis XIV included royal institutions such as the Paris Academy of Sciences and university institutions such as the Faculty of Medicine, as well as an array of salons, private academies, and independent lecturers that both complemented and competed with more official bodies. Science was embedded in other cultural pursuits, not only because Louis and his chief minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, aimed to control cultural production, but also because the same people practiced science, architecture, art, music, and literature simultaneously. The court of Louis exercised control by means of its patronage, but that control developed gradually, and despite the best efforts of Colbert and his successors, it was never all-encompassing. Much has been written about the way Louis reigned in the aristocracy via the court life of Versailles. Much less has been written about the government functionaries, some aristocratic, some bourgeois, and other professionals in Paris, including physicians, lawyers, and a variety of religious men, who attended salons and academies and the opera, published works of literary criticism alongside works of science, and acted at various times as both patrons and clients in Parisian cultural life. These men cannot easily be labeled as ancients or moderns, although by the end of the 17th century, the moderns had definitely come to dominate. Because of the place of science among other cultural pursuits in Louis XIV's Paris, I talk about a lot of things in this book then that at first glance may seem to have little to do with science. Not only printing, publishing, and illustration, whose connections with natural knowledge are now well established, but also music, architecture, literature, rhetoric, and aesthetics. Historians of early modern Europe know that modern disciplines did not then exist, and that the quest for knowledge mapped a myriad of paths through its broad terrain. But too often historians, including me, have nonetheless focused on a disciplinary corner of that terrain. The people I consider in this book have made a narrowly focused disciplinary study impossible. Such men as Claude Perrault, Louis Guéant, Jean Paquet, and Joseph-Guichard Duverney are not household names, even among historians of the era. But in Paris, they were the most important investigators of the human and animal body. Bobby did the rest of the introduction. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the first chapter, and then I'm going to read a little bit about the Perrault brothers going to the opera. So beginning of chapter 1, a geography of Paris anatomy in the 17th century. Under cover of night, the dead of Paris made their journey from the burial grounds to the places of dissection. In this era of recurrent plagues, their numbers never dwindled, and for 3 centuries, from the 1530s, they did not lie quiet in their graves. The cemetery of Holy Innocents between the Rue de la Ferronnerie and the Rue Saint-Denis was one of the few places with street lamps until Louis XIV ordered the installation of thousands of candle lanterns across Paris. But its dim beacon did not deter the trade in the dead, as physicians and surgeons exhumed bodies. Shadows from their torches made the danse macabre carved into the wall of one of the bone houses, the chamiers, seemed to move. Holy Innocents had been filled many times over, and as new bodies came in, the bones of the old were disinterred and placed in the chamiers. The famous Flemish anatomist Andreas Wesel, known as Vesalius, fondly remembered the piles of bones at the Holy Innocents during his days as a medical student, and these bones are now all in the catacombs in Paris. He and his friends blindfolded themselves and took bets as to who could identify the most bones by touch. The smell of decomposing flesh permeated the quartier. The medical men and their apprentices trundled the bodies from Holy Innocents south down the Rue Saint-Denis, the Road of Kings. At the river, they came to the fortress of the Grand Châtelet, which housed the office of the Prévôt de Paris that administered the king's justice, as well as court and prisons and the 2nd Street lamp in Paris. By the end of the 16th century, anatomy teachers offered a variety of courses and demonstrations. The content, setting, and style of anatomical lectures varied widely, from perfunctory demonstrations of surgical techniques to detailed expositions of structure and function, according to Galenic theory. They took place mainly in university settings, but also before corporate bodies of medical men, and in private rooms to fee-paying audiences. In his 1610 dissection manual, La Semaine Pratique Anatomique, basically the week of anatomy, the surgeon Nicolas Abicot described an ideal anatomical subject. He would be a young man between 25 and 30. Older subjects were too cold and dry. He would be well-fleshed. Drowning victims were best, although the anatomist had to hang the subject upside down by his heels and press the water out before cutting. Victims of strangling or decapitation were less bizarre. Although many anatomists advised starting with animals, Abicot advised against it, but he admitted that animals had their uses. However, this ideal candidate, or any human corpse at all, would have been difficult to come by for the many who wished to dissect. This was not because the dead body held any special religious meaning. Catholic doctrine was quite clear that the body would be resurrected whole, no matter what indignities it may have suffered before or after death. Pope Boniface VIII in the early 14th century had forbidden the division of the body after death in his bull De Testate Veritatis. But he directed his ire at the trade in relics, not an anatomical demonstration, which hardly existed at that time. And the bull did not claim a special value for the dead body. The urge to protect the body after death was personal and cultural, rather than legal or religious. Few were willing to allow their bodies or those of their loved ones to be dissected, and municipalities grudgingly granted a few bodies of executed criminals a year to medical faculties for their yearly public demonstrations. Many anatomists were not content with what they could learn in these demonstrations, and to find out more about the human body, they sought additional corpses and animals to dissect. In addition, anatomical preparation with skeletons supplemented these dissections, and their construction also required human corpses or body parts. Dead and alive, animals far outnumbered human corpses on 17th century dissection tables. So I'm going to go back to talking about humans. Even before they reached the dissection room, the human dead commingled with animals. The stalls of Les Halles, the biggest market in Paris, backed up to the walls of Holy Innocents, and even encroached on the space inside the walls. The stench of Holy Innocents soon mingled with the stink of the Rue de la Boucherie, Butcher's Row, up against the wall of the Châtelet. In the dark, the medical men could not see the butchers or the offal they threw into the Seine that stained its banks red with blood, according to the chronicler Louis-Sebastien Messier, and marked with blood the streets that surrounded the fortress as well. The Tour Saint-Jacques, kind of landmark in Paris, is all that now remains of the butcher's church, Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie. Here, during the day, the anatomists could get the pigs and sheep they preferred to dissect alive, as well as animal parts for practice. But night was the time to round up the stray cats and dogs that anatomists used by the dozen. The Paris Academy of Sciences employed a man to find cats and dogs, but they were not difficult to find. Cats haunted the rooftops and cellars of the city and, complained to contemporaries, celebrate a witch's Sabbath all night long with their howls. Once a year, one of the commissaires de la ville rounded up a sack of cats to be burned alive on the bonfires celebrating the feast of St. John the Baptist. Cats generally did not follow the sharply defined social hierarchy afforded to dogs, although it was well known that Louis XIII's minister Claude Perrault loved his cats, as did Louis XIV's minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Later in the century, the garden of the Salonière, Madame de Villiers, featured an elaborate marble tomb to her cat Mimi. The lapdogs depicted in portraits, known as chiens de manchon, literally muff dogs, small enough to be carried in a lady's muff, led very pampered lives. Louis XIV built elaborate velour-draped niches for his favorites. But many dogs simply wandered the streets. Scenes of urban life often depicted one or more dogs at their margins. The small interior courtyard of the Châtelet that served as a morgue held animaux urbains, urban animals of another kind, corpses of the drowned and the anonymous found found dead in the streets, who were exposed to await identification. Those that remained unidentified were conveyed to a nearby convent, whose sisters washed the bodies and prepared them for burial of holy innocents, conveying them to the burial ground after dusk. But these dead often did not reach their destination. The English physician Martin Lister reported disapprovingly in 1698 that the anatomist Duverney obtained some of the many bodies he used for anatomical demonstrations from the Châtelet, where, said Lister, those are exposed who are found murdered in the streets, which is a very common business in Paris. From the Châtelet, the doctors crossed the Pont au Change to the Ile de la Cité, passing the stalls of blood booksellers on their way to yet another source of corpses, the medieval foundation of the Hôtel Dieu, the largest hospital in Paris, which occupied several buildings next to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. During the day, medical men could witness many autopsies at the hospital on the corpses of the poor. Duverney held court there from the 1680s to the 17 teens, witnessed by physicians, surgeons, residents, apprentices, and medical students. Earlier in the century, the great anatomist Jean-Violin the Younger gave a private anatomy course in a house on the square in front of Notre Dame, between the hospital and the bishop's residence. The Hôtel Dieu treated thousands of patients per year, and in the words of Mercier the Chronicle, it daily vomited the dead. Until the early 1670s, the hospital buried its dead not at Holy Innocents, but farther to the north along the Rue Saint-Denis, at the cemetery of the Hospital of the Trinity, a public lodging house for pilgrims. La Trinité had large pits for mass burials in times of plague, and as at Holy Innocents, bones were regularly exhumed and placed in charniers to make room for more corpses. From the Hôtel Dieu, the doctors could look back across the river to the Hôtel de Ville and the wide open area in front of it known as the Place de Grève, where most of the executions in Paris took place. Surgeons in particular came to executions in the hope of gaining an illicit corpse. From the gates of the Hôtel Dieu, the men could cross the Seine again at the recently opened Pont au Double or at the Pont de l'Hôtel Dieu. Only a few yards away on the left bank stood the Paris Faculty of Medicine. Anatomists of all kinds worked in the medieval warren of left bank streets that spread out from the Sorbonne, known as the Latin Quarter. Before it built an anatomical theater in 1620, the Paris Faculty of Medicine had established a site for dissection in the early 16th century at the Hôtel de Neve, where the Institut de France now sits, directly across from the Louvre, across from the famous Pont des Arts, where all the blocks are. The tower of the Hôtel de Neve contained the third street light in Paris to guide boatmen along the Seine. But when a century later the faculty finally built a lecture theater, it was located next to its ancient headquarters in the House of the Iron Crown, at the corner of the Rue des Rats and the Rue de la Boucherie. This is U with a umlaut, not butchers, but actually woodcutters. So that's the beginning. So the Perrauts were, they were actually 5 brothers, and a couple of them died fairly young. So by the 1670s, there were 3 brothers. Their father was a lawyer, and they all went into somewhat different careers. So Claude was a physician. He went to the Paris Faculty of Medicine, he graduated in 1641. His brother Pierre ended up being a kind of financier for the crown. And Charles started his career as a poet, and then ended up kind of, by very good social sense, glomming onto Colbert when Colbert came into power in the 1660s. He had been a client of a guy named Nicolas Fouquet, who was kind of angling to be Louis XIV's chief minister, and Fouquet had a spectacular fall in 1661 where he was accused of embezzlement. His estates were confiscated. He ended up being exiled to the Piedmont. And so Charles Perrault, as well as many other people, kind of did a kind of little dance over to Colbert because it looked like Colbert By the late 1660s, Joseph-Guichard was really becoming pretty important to Colbert. He became kind of Colbert's right-hand man, so this was a good thing. And one of the reasons that Claude Perrault becomes such an important figure in the Paris Academy of Sciences is undoubtedly because he is the brother of Charles. It's not because he had any particular virtues of his own, because he had done pretty much nothing in his career up to that time. When he's appointed to the Paris Academy of Sciences, he is 53 years old. He has not published anything except some satirical poems with his brothers. And he's a member of the Paris faculty and apparently practiced medicine, but nobody knows anything about this. So he had not made a big mark. Although for the next 20 years of his life, he made an enormous mark. So it's like, for all you late bloomers out there, so helps to have a brother who is the man chief minister. Okay. So this is from chapter 5, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the opera, because you might wonder how the opera fits with all this stuff. So, one evening at the end of January in 1674, the Perrault brothers, Claude, Pierre, and Charles, joined the crowds at the Palais Royal with their friend, the court painter Charles Lebrun, to see a performance of Jean-Baptiste Lully's Alceste, a tragic opera, opéra tragique, in the Italian style, with a libretto by Philippe Quinault based on the ancient Greek play by Euripides. The king and Madame de Montespan had viewed a performance at Versailles a few months earlier, but both Quinault's interpretation of the classical work and Lully's music proved controversial. By the summer, following several more performances, Charles Perrault issued an anonymous critique of the opera that defended modern music. This was something that was definitely under dispute in this period. Between 1671 and 1673, Charles had been elected to the Académie Française, which is a kind of big literary society sponsored by the Crown. And Colbert had named him one of the general controllers of buildings, gardens, and arts and manufactures of the king. So this was a position of considerable power. He wielded a lot of patronage if you were one of the controllers. So Charles Perrault soon dropped the facade of anonymity, reprinting his critique of the opera in his collected works in 1675. And in his dedication, he said, oh no, he's not talking about ancients versus moderns. He's not going to take a position on that. He simply was expressing his own ideas. Perrault's essay, appearing among a number of panegyrics to the king in this line, it's all full of like poems saying, Louis XIV is a great guy, tacitly acknowledged the role opera played in the kind of glory machine of Louis's court. The playwright Jean Racine and the critic Nicolas Boileau fiercely attacked Louis's opera and Charles Perrault's defense. Although Boileau had penned a critique of the Paris Faculty of Medicine in 1671, his major work, La Poétique, the poetic art, in 1674, staunchly defended ancient literature and the classical style of Racine and Pierre Corneille. He also took the time to direct a few blows towards his former physician, Claude Perrault, who we refer to as a celebrated assassin. Le célèbre assassin, that's much better. The Perrault brothers had satirized the ancients 20 years earlier in their verse burlesque called The Walls of Troy, written in the 1650s. Claude had at that time written the second chapter of that satire, prefaced by his essay, The Mythology of the Walls of Troy. They characterized ancient poetry as primitive, and its modern imitators, which would include people like Racine, as ridiculous. Although this work remained unpublished, Boileau certainly knew the Perrault brothers' opinions. Racine, too, defended the honor of the ancients in the preface to his play Iphigenia. Charles Perrault argued that the success of the opera among honest men proved the superiority of the modern version, and indeed the tragédie en musique soon overtook in popularity the tragédie classique of Corneille and Racine. Claude Perrault, in a lot of this chapter is about Claude Perrault's works on sound and on music. So Claude Perrault's works on music then situated sound and the particular kinds of sound that constituted music at the forefront of cultural debates as well as scientific debates about the nature of the senses and therefore of epistemology and knowledge. Perrault's preface took up the theme of the mythology of the wall of Troy, that the ancients were overrated. The essential beauty of modern harmony was simply unknown to them. Much of his essay on the music of the ancients, which is kind of an odd thing to put in front of a scientific treatise on sound anyways. So, much of on the music of the ancients is a humanist examination of ancient texts. It summarized work that Claude Perrault had already presented in his translation of the Roman architect Vitruvius, which had included, weirdly enough, a large chart explaining the music theory of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristophanes. On the music of the ancients sought to prove that ancient music was not harmonic in the modern sense. In particular, the ancients had no knowledge of counterpoint, the combination of two or more melodic lines. Their music was essentially primitive. He really likes this word, primitive. And its beauty was the beauty we perceive in ancient ruins. Perrault even compared it to the music of the barbarous nations of the New World. Ancient music, he said, sufficed to satisfy the heart and the senses, but it did not engage the mind or the imagination, l'esprit. So too, only those with sufficient knowledge and intelligence could fully appreciate modern polyphonic music. This was what constituted taste, which varied over time as well as among individuals. Perrault gave the example of the Roman fermented fish condiment garum, which the ancients loved to excess, and which recent centuries viewed as an abomination. Is it indeed so strange, said Perrault, that the moderns have invented a new and more beautiful music, knowing what has also recently been discovered in natural philosophy and mechanics, but its beauties were not open to all. Like his brother Charles, Claude as courtier glorified modern music to glorify the king, whose era, as Charles would write a few years later, surpassed even that of